The fact that Isaac Asimov's Foundation series is loosely based thematically on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and is specifically inspired by Edward Gibbon's 6-volume set about this, is something that you'll often find mentioned in encyclopedia articles about it or quick guides to Asimov's work. But what often goes unmentioned is the fact that Gibbons was reworking material from the Middle Ages by people like Petrarch in an Enlightenment era. In a similar fashion, Asimov was reworking material in the early 1940s, just prior to the atomic age, and that's why I've used the word mulch to describe it. They were taking material, using it, throwing away what they felt was unnecessary, and refertilizing themselves as they went on. Now, on the next slide, I've chosen to use AI to illustrate how much of a seminal work Asimov's classic novel has become. I asked AI to generate a scene from Foundation. I didn't give it a particular scene, I just asked it to generate a scene randomly. And it threw up this. And since AI is essentially a large learning model and draws from all over the internet, you can see it's drawn architecture that's Romanesque to an extent. The pillar in the middle is actually from the books and fills a particular plot point in there, and the starships in the sky, and the fact that these citizens are wearing might be loosely described as medieval clothing that's reminiscent of a monk. So the themes that underlie the book have actually become very much part of popular culture, since it drew that in under 30 seconds. And worryingly, that piece of art would look perfectly at home on a 1970s cover of a popular edition of Foundation, and it was drawn in 30 seconds or so. Since Asimov's Foundation and Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of Rome are central to the argument of this presentation, it might be helpful to have a short amount of background on both. Asimov's Foundation was published as a collected edition for the first time in 1951, but had been published as stories and novellas in Astounding Stories long before that, and it was inspired by a conversation with John W. Campbell about whether the fall of the Roman Empire would make a good model for a series of stories. It's set thousands of years in the future, and one of its central themes is the use of what's called psychohistory to predict the future. This is done via the character Harry Seldon, who predicts a fall of what looks like at that point a healthy empire, but he foresees cracks in the foundations, if you'll forgive the bad pun. At first he annoys the emperors of the Foundation by doing this, but eventually they concede he's right, and he sets up a planet on a wider library and a place to retain what learning he can on the world of Terminus. This proves to be a fake out, as he already has a second Foundation planned in case the first one fails. But Foundation is essentially a story of how an empire that spans a galaxy might slowly fall apart and revert to barbarism. And of course, it mirrors on a giant scale how Rome fell, or at least how Edward Gibbons imagined Rome falling, and I'll turn to him in a moment. Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire was published in 6 very, very large volumes across a 13-year period. Most people think of it as chronicling the fall of the Western Empire. In fact, it covers the fall of the Eastern and Western empires, has quite a large section about the Khans, and goes right up to the fall of Byzantium to the Turks. So it's not just about the Western Empire. Now, Gibbons advanced a theory that Christianity played a large role in the fall of the empire by undermining civic virtue, although that's hardly the only thing he touched on. He also touched upon the loss of civic virtue via the arrival of outsiders, the use of them as troops to prop up the failing republic, and so on. In the time Asimov was writing, Gibbon's work formed a paradigm that was common as a way of looking at how the Roman Empire fell. Although it had been challenged even then to some extent, it was still the most common view of how the empire fell. Slow erosion of virtue, slow erosion of a civic virtue, slow erosion of the will to resist, too many barbarians coming in, admixture of peoples, etc. Gibbons was also an Enlightenment writer, and there's a reason I mention that, because His view of the church causing the empire to fail is one that was at odds with earlier writers that he reprocessed himself, and I'll turn to those in a few seconds. Should be said, to an extent, Gibbon's magnum opus falls into the category of books that have had a large influence on history and on the teaching of history, but probably aren't really read all that much. I'm going to ask everyone in the audience to put up their hands if you've actually read this book, and I don't mean extracts, read the whole thing. I certainly haven't. I've read bits and pieces of it, but it formed the standard model to regard the fall of Rome, and was a classic thought at universities for decades. And yet, it's perhaps not the entire story. It puts forward the theory of Dark Ages, and that didn't start with Gibbon's. He repurposes it from writers in the Middle Ages, who would have looked at it from a slightly different angle than he would have. They certainly saw it as a Dark Age, but their view of it as a Dark Age was based on the fact that Christianity had gone missing, not that Christianity appeared. One thing which does unite Asimov and Gibbon's view of empires, and if we wish to compare the fictional galactic empire and Rome, is that they both have a central capital to which provincials feel overwhelmed when they arrive there. Let me read out this quote from Asimov. This was Trantor. The air seemed a little thick here, the gravity a bit greater than his home planet of Synax. But he would get used to that. He would wonder if he would ever get used to immensity. Debarkation building was tremendous. The roof was almost lost in the heights. Gull could almost imagine that clouds could form beneath its immensity. And if you compare that to Gibbon, writing about the empire, it seems probable that there existed in the time of Claudius about twice as many provincials as there were citizens, of either sex and of every age, and that the slaves were at least equal in number to the free inhabitants of the Roman world. The total amount of this imperfect calculation would rise to about 120 millions of persons, which by the standards of the ancient world was a huge empire indeed, and run from a central point, just as Asimov's fictional empire is. In some respects, Asimov's empire is slightly more civilized. Slavery does not exist as such, although there are indications that there are worlds that are underdeveloped and isolated. But there's still the feeling of there's a central world place where everyone is the civilization and part of the civilization, and those outside it are provincial nobodies. And that fed into the idea of the Dark Age that occurred after the fall of both empires, which Gibbons developed. He developed a theory that basically Europe evolved into feuding states where civilization dropped away. But he didn't evolve that theory out of nowhere, even though he repurposed it to fit Enlightenment ideas which concentrated on a different view of religion. And the people he repurposed it from were people who viewed the church as having a central place in the state. If Gibbons provided a source of what might be termed literary fertilizer for Asimov on which his imagination could work, both were carrying forward an image of the Dark Ages in medieval Europe as a time when much of the science and learning of Rome was lost. Such views became the accepted view of this era. The Tuscan writer Petrarch remarked that Homer was dumb to him while he was deaf to Homer, or in other words, ancient Greek and the learning of Greeks had gone and was only rediscovered via contact with the Islamic world eventually. There was a view that monasteries became places of learnings which were islands of civilization amongst barbarity, and that learning was preserved in these. It's a view you'll encounter in Petrarch, and a view that but he views Christianity as essential to preserving the civilization and essential to ensuring it might rise again, whereas Gibbon viewed Christianity as both a force that eventually destroyed the empire due to weakening the virtues that were engendered in its earlier years. However, both these views of the Dark Age have been remulched, if you will. People have re-examined them in recent years and found some of it to be true, some of it to be less true, and it's a debate that continues now. But, as I pointed out earlier, when Asimov wrote Foundation, it was a generally accepted view. Views today would point out that the Dark Ages perhaps were not quite so dark. There were periods where large cathedrals were built, seats of learning established, monetary large empires evolved, such as Charlemagne's, and calling it the Dark Ages is perhaps a simplistic and reductionist term. But Asimov uses it as a motif for the books. Essentially, they're presented as a way to prevent the fall of night, if you will. Harry Seldon's Foundation Preserving Science is presented as a place like the ancient monasteries, where what's best about humanity is preserved in an isolated manner, and after the empire falls, or as it slowly disintegrates into various smaller states and groups of planets, it presumes it, and it becomes considered almost superstitiously, in a superstitious manner, as almost a place of magic. Asimov doesn't ever quite use his characters in a religious manner, but he does have a number of characters who belong to an order of what might be called technological monks. They realise that they are only using science, but they're quite happy to tell the locals that it's magic until they induct them into the order. And that perhaps reveals something of the science fiction of the era's view of religion, and a rather cynical view, it might be said, or you could argue an accurate view. It would depend on your viewpoint about religion. The first person to use galactic empires or galactic worlds, but he's certainly become perhaps the most influential writer. Robert Heinlein had a series of books which are now rather more forgotten, which used an earlier version of a galactic empire and a future of humanity. But those are less remembered, and certainly not the most well remembered of Heinlein's work. But here's an example of a selection of books that in some way or other draw on themes from Asimov's. Brian Aldiss' Galactic Empires from the 1970s collected up a large number of stories which featured galactic empires. Ian Banks' Culture series does draw to an extent on the Foundation. It's also one of the few examples of an empire that might be regarded to some extent as utopian, or that operates on a scale that makes even Foundation look small at times, as does Hyperion. Triplanetary by E. Smith is, well, I'm not quite sure how to describe it. Pulp blockbuster that inspired everything from Green Lantern in comic books to sort of Star Wars, although Foundation might arguably be regarded as inspiring quite a lot of Star Wars as well. The conflict between failing empires and so on. Among others, remulching each other. In conclusion, while the influence of Gibbon's magnum opus is perhaps essential to consider when examining Foundation as a text, consideration should be given to those literary figures whose themes Gibbon reworked, and I think that sometimes gets forgotten, that there's an underlying strata of work underneath Gibbon that Gibbon was repurposing due to political and social considerations of his own era, whereas it's just taken as a straight Gibbon tells you it's the Dark Age, but Gibbon did not exist in splendid isolation. Also, though Asimov's Foundation series is one of a select number of texts within the genre of science fiction that can potentially be regarded as seminal, it's not sacrosanct and shouldn't be regarded as such. The last slide of this presentation is a short clip of a recent adaptation of Asimov's work. As characters were race and gender swapped, and other cultural influences such as East Asian ones influenced the presentation of this show, a debate arose about the purity of the show regarding the source material. I tend to regard such debates as odd. I view this as healthy. Debate is to be welcome and suggests the material is still relevant enough to be reinvigorated or remulched for a further generation.